defy you to name me one Kubrick film that you can turn off once you started. It's impossible. He's got this fail-safe button or something. It's impossible to turn off a Kubrick film.
Every shot has some special effort put into it, some extra bit of concern with composition or lighting or traveling or something. And so he never lets down.
He worked so hard on the imagery, you know, I mean, I believe Stanley probably started a movie with several images in his mind and then let the story evolve from there, got it very concrete.
Shining is the perfect example of a horror genre movie that does not employ the classical horror genre visual elements.
I think the thing about it is that he creates a setting that has a certain kind of peacefulness that belies the story that he's telling.
This is our Colorado lounge.
Oh, it's beautiful.
You know it's extraordinary from the very first shot. Those first helicopter shots tell you that somebody's at the helm who's saying, you know, I'm not just going to give you a helicopter shot, I'm going to give you the longest, steadiest helicopter shot. And how graceful they were, and how misleading that is in terms of what's coming.
Nothing indicates that the horror may happen in this movie. And it's a very conscious decision because by creating that kind of visual style, you're creating a sense of normalcy, but by doing that, the horror that the characters are experiencing becomes much more believable.
You better run fast. I'm coming in close. Just have to keep him in.
You know, there's something very intuitive and wonderful about the way he will find these things that will just become archetypal. The blood coming out of the elevator and the twins, that's very much reminiscent of Diane Arbus's photographs. He'll just totally throw these images at you in a way that will just set you off. The greatest one for me, though, is still the image of the written page, just pages and pages. Your terror in that movie comes from the characters. You're being frightened by a realization of who these characters are. She's curious about what he's written, and he has piles and piles of typewritten pages that all say, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy. That's the point at which there's a kind of turning point in the movie. It's the most perfect representation of insanity that you could possibly come up with.
How do you like it?
When the snow begins to fall outside the windows and it begins to build up and you go out into it, and it's always blizzard. It's never cool with blue skies, you know, it's always dark and blizzard and blowing snow. That sense of cold just accumulates.
Action, Shelley!
Go, Barry.
Stanley, with his, photography sense, had this great idea of using fog so that it looked really cold, but he never wanted to see the fog move, It just gave the sense of like a filter almost. So you could only shoot when the wind was less than 3 knots. It took a long, long time to get all the shots we needed. He'd seen some war pictures shot in snow, some black and white, and he realised that there was a diffusion, the cold, foggy get in snow, and he said, let's try it. So we did, and it was brilliant. I mean, he wouldn't have looked as cold without that smoke.
It was actually a poisonously yellow-looking set with the lights. Stanley did all his own lab timing, so by the time the dailies came back, they'd cranked up the blue and cranked out all the red and yellow, and it looked as it looks in the film, frigid, wintry, cold, mysterious place.
Filmmakers always look for ways to allow the audience to participate in the movie. One of the ways to allow the audience to be active participant is to have mobile camera.
Mr. Ullman?
Yes?
I'm Jack Torrance.
Oh, well, come on in, Jack.
When it comes to The Shining, you think of the camera prowling. You think of the camera close to the floor. It's almost as if there's another character in there following people about. And of course there is. The hotel is keeping an eye on all the characters. So perhaps the camera in The Shining is the hotel.
You're right there with the character. You don't know what's going to happen. Is something going to attack the little boy? It feels very dangerous. It feels very invading.
It's a film about film, in part. What was the necessity of traveling down that hallway? Well, he did it because he could.
I think sometimes Stanley just did that because he didn't want to be like everybody else, and he had a very specific way of telling a story. It's not that he wanted to show off, I'm so different than you, but he said, why does every story have to be told the same way?
And I think that Kubrick had reached a point, frankly, that the more profound ideas that he had expressed in earlier films now had to be presented to a different audience. An audience that had started to find the horror film diet very attractive and commercial.
One thing I could never stand was to see a filthy, dirty old drunkie howling away at the filthy songs of his fathers.
You can identify Kubrick in all sorts of ways in any one of his films, but one of the really admirable things about him is that he chooses such different projects. There are linkages between them, but they're very different sorts of films, finally. One of the characteristics that's so striking about these films is the sense of the visual that you remember long after you've seen the film. I think a mark of a great director is that you leave the theater with certain images forever marked on your mind. And that's certainly true of Kubrick.
Give me your answer. I first met him in New York probably in the very early 1950s. And he was already becoming a mythic figure, was already this famous person who had started shooting for Look when he was 3 years old or something like that, you know. So he was protege-ish. He was the most provocative, intelligent filmmaker I've ever known.
His experience in using a still camera probably really helped him, you know, from a photographic point of view. And he certainly understood the way you tell things with visual images. And I'm sure a little bit of that at least comes from the fact that he had been a still photographer.
I don't think he was obsessive about images. I think he just had great taste and was a great photographer and cameraman. So he knew where to put the camera all the time, you know, and so it looked seamless. So, I mean, it was wonderful because all of his pictures looked wonderful. Invariably, the images would be startling. Certainly, Barry Lyndon was creating a time and a place, and so what he did was very effectively take us back to that, and you had a sense of what it was like.
If you can imagine that he was a consummately gifted photographer professionally, he was also a consummately successful chess hustler. And if you think about that and combine the mind of a really complex chess player with the eye of a perfect perfectionist photographer, you have Stanley.
Ready now! Run! Quick!
One thing that I love about Stanley's images is that his compositions were very simple. They were very simple and very direct. But there's something about that directness that's very disturbing.
He's very good at creating his own sort of stylistic use of various techniques.